Heraclon Publishing presents the Avro Arrow for the Record by Palmiro Campagna. Narrated by Mark Hebscher. Preface. Recently, there's been a resurgence of interest in the Avro Arrow. This is partly because the Canadian government is in the midst of deciding which plane to buy to serve as the new fighter jet for the Royal Canadian Air Force. There are many who wish to see a homegrown product, a renewed Arrow, developed. They argue that Canada could create a better and cheaper plane than anything that could be purchased elsewhere. The Avro Arrow has also been in the news of late because of the renewed search for the 1/8 scale test models of the plane that were launched into Lake Ontario in the 1950s as part of the original test program to prove out the aerodynamics of the design. With this latest search for the models underway, the debate has resumed over the merits of the program and the reasons for its cancellation. Many of the same arguments and errors of fact are again being put forward. Back in the day, the government stated that the decision to terminate the program was made because of the changing military threat Canada faced. It was claimed at the time that the threat from manned bombers was diminishing, while intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, were about to become the primary problem. The Arrow would have been useless against the latter. It was decided that rather than spend money on the Arrow to fight off a diminished manned bomber threat, surface-to-air missiles, namely the U.S.-manufactured Bomarks, would be deployed. Some historians and journalists have argued that the Arrow was technically flawed, a position, as it turned out, involved misidentification with another aircraft. Others have claimed that it simply cost too much, partly because of cost-plus contracts that Avro had negotiated with the government with increasing costs as the project progressed. Confirming the facts has been difficult. To a significant degree, the atmosphere in which the debate about the Arrow has taken place has been clouded by emotion, and crucial information that would have helped to resolve the issues has not been available. It was once believed that all documents relating to the program had either been destroyed or had been classified, and that therefore there was little written proof of whether the aircraft really was good or bad, what the costs of the program were, or even who was ultimately responsible for the destruction of the plane, its parts, and the tools and plans used in its manufacture. Lack of certainty about the last point allowed the company and its president, Crawford Gordon Jr., to be maligned, as was the Prime Minister of the day, John Diefenbaker. Indeed, commenting on the subject of documentation, Canadian historian Desmond Morton, in an interview printed in Engineering Dimensions, the journal published by the Professional Engineers of Ontario in 1988, noted the following, quote, "When I look at the story of the Arrow, which was only a quarter century ago, there's a great deal that's hidden. I'm denied access to what went on in Cabinet, in the Prime Minister's office, in the Department of National Defense. What I'd like to see would be access legislation being used to open up all the records related to the Arrow, including the decision to destroy the prototypes." Fueled by a desire to uncover what documents, if any, that had allegedly been destroyed as part of the termination of the Arrow program actually remained, and what documents still existed that had been intentionally sequestered, I sought to find as many of them as I could and have them all declassified if possible. My quest began in the late 1980s in the archives of Canada, the United States, and Britain. A number of these I referenced in my first two books on the subject, Storms of Controversy, The Secret Avro Arrow Files Revealed, and Requiem for a Giant, Avro Canada, and the Avro Arrow. I have been asked how it was that I discovered so many of the documents. Simply, through a lot of hard work. When I initially requested the files on the Arrow in the early 1980s, archivists at Library and Archives Canada provided a small folder with very little information. To uncover more, I discovered that the trick was to search all of the finding aids provided. I subsequently requested, through the Access to Information procedure, records pertaining to North American continental air defense from 1946 to 1961, any files related to aircraft or aircraft equipment in that time period, and the records of the various departments involved in decisions about the Arrow program, not just those of national defense. Once the records were declassified, it was necessary to wade through thousands of pages of documents, searching for anything related to the Arrow development and to the politics behind the decision to cancel. Once a relevant document was found, it was possible to determine which other departments or individuals had received a copy and to then request additional information from their records. Not knowing where to look for things, or even what I was looking for, needless to say, made the search extremely difficult. To ensure that I got as complete a picture as possible of the information and issues relating to the Arrow, it was essential that I look at everything available that might be even remotely connected to the program. This took years to do. Today, one can call up online the thematic guide on the Avro Arrow on the Library and Archives Canada website and easily find the related government records and respective file numbers on the Arrow. Still, though, many records are not accessible online. For example, in the files for another development project from the 1950s, one related to the Arrow, the Velvet Glove development, there were 4,667 physical records to search through, just in case they might contain some additional information on the Arrow itself. These records were finally declassified and yielded what appears to be those allowing for the identification of the artifact pulled from Lake Ontario in August of 2018. All classified records have to be reviewed in accordance with access to information legislation by the appropriate departments, although many believe there is a 30-year rule by which documents are automatically declassified after 30 years. Archivists maintain that there is no such rule per se. So it is still necessary to file access requests for all records that one wishes to look at in order to have them reviewed. The archivists are not necessarily able to methodically go through all of the files to review them for possible release because they either do not have the resources or the specific knowledge to make declassification decisions on the thousands upon thousands of records in the collections. In order to make a determination whether something should still remain classified, regardless of the number of years that have passed since the creation of the document, knowledge of the subject area and of any applicable legislation is needed. Some of the documents on the Arrow took between 1 and 2 years for declassification because they contained information from countries other than Canada, and so had to be sent to those countries for their review. Other documents contained material relating to national security, and so that had to be severed by the appropriate authorities. In the end, as in all cases, it was application of the Access to Information Act and of related legislation, such as the Privacy Act, that determined what might or might not be declassified. When one considers the impact of the Arrow story, the technical superiority of the plane, and the immense loss that resulted from the cancellation of the program, the effect on the company, the destruction of the plane, the loss of so many jobs, both at Avro Canada and at its suppliers, and perhaps most significantly, the accompanying loss of so many talented engineers who could have contributed so much more to Canada, i.e. the brain drain, one can begin to understand why interest in the Arrow has continued over the years and why emotions run so deep. If one looks at how the program has been maligned by some and then examines the actual records relating to the Arrow, which seem to demonstrate that, in fact, the plane was extraordinary, the result is frustration, if not anger. Through the use of the documented record, I have sought to provide greater detail, clarification, and amplification of the facts relating to the key questions about the Arrow and its cancellation. Additional material is provided here for the benefit of the reader in hopes of finally putting to bed most, if not all, of the questions that are still the subject of controversy. The aim is also to introduce the story anew to those who are not familiar with the Arrow, but who may have heard of it in light of current events. 1. A future lost. During the Second World War, Britain looked to Canada for assistance in providing Lancaster bombers. The National Steel Car plant in Malton, Ontario, was chosen to manufacture those bombers, as it was already building aircraft parts. In November 1942, the federal government acquired the company, changing its name to Victory Aircraft Limited. The firm soon became renowned for building superior Lancasters. In 1943, Sir Roy Dobson, managing director of Avro Arrow, a division of Hawker Siddeley, located in Manchester, UK, visited the company and was very impressed. After the war, Sir Roy returned to Canada, and working with Fred T. Smythe, the director of aircraft production at Victory, and other Victory officials, established discussions with C.D. Howe, the Canadian Minister of Munitions and Supply, to acquire Victory on a rental purchase plan, providing the management of Hawker Siddeley agreed. On December 1, 1945, the deal was finalized, and Avro Arrow Canada was established. Fred Smythe was appointed Assistant General Manager and would become the administrative force behind Avro Arrow Canada's projects. The creation of the company meant that Canada at last had the capacity to design and build its own aircraft, both for the commercial market and for the Royal Canadian Air Force, RCAF, freeing it from the necessity of relying on foreign sources. In 1946, Turbo Research Limited, another Crown corporation, this one involved in engine research, was acquired by Avro Arrow to design and build engines. On December 2, 1954, Avro Arrow was split into the newly named Avro Division, responsible for aircraft design and production, and Orenda, responsible for engine design and production. After much discussion with officials from TransCanada Airlines and C.D. Howe, Avro Arrow was given the go-ahead to embark on the C-102 jetliner design, a commercial, regional, passenger jet aircraft, a type of aircraft that didn't exist at the time. Likewise, after separate discussions with the RCAF and Howe, the CF-100, a military subsonic fighter, was given the green light. Both were begun in 1946. The jetliner would fly in 1949, but would not be produced. At the time, it was said that the company had to focus on the CF-100 for the Korean War effort. The CF-100, though, would not become operational until 1953, after that war was over. In January 1952, the RCAF realized that the CF-100 would need to be replaced as it could soon be rendered obsolete as a defense tool for Canada by advances in Soviet aircraft design. Following deliberations between Canada, the United States, and Great Britain, and the examination of numerous studies of existing aircraft, a decision was made to design and develop a supersonic jet interceptor, the Avro Arrow. The plan was to design a plane able to prevent any attack from Soviet aircraft entering North American airspace from over the North Pole. It would need to have a speed and altitude capability not then available in any other military aircraft. By the time the Avro Arrow program was canceled on February 20, 1959, a date dubbed Black Friday by the media, Avro Arrow Canada Limited had become the third largest company in Canada behind the Canadian Pacific Railway and the Aluminum Company of Canada. Part of Avro Arrow's portfolio of companies included the Dominion Steel and Coal Corporation, along with numerous others, but its key subsidiaries remained Avro, its aircraft division, and Orenda, its engine division. When the Arrow program was terminated, some 25,000 employees lost their jobs. 14,000 of those had been working for Avro and Orenda. The rest were employed by the company's various other subsidiaries or by the subcontractors working on the program. On February 26, 1959, 10,000 employees packed into the Coliseum building at the Canadian National Exhibition Grounds in Toronto in a massive protest against the cancellation, the government, and in particular, the Prime Minister, John Diefenbaker. Many had signs indicating they had voted for the Conservatives once, but would never do so again. In the end, the protests had no effect in getting the cancellation reversed. Diefenbaker would, however, go on to be defeated in the election of 1963. The fallout from the cancellation was enormous and extended far beyond the obviously significant loss of 25,000 jobs. The Financial Post of September 20, 1958, published a list of businesses across Canada that would lose contracts as a result of the termination. The article stated that 100,000 Canadians would be affected, along with many new industries, particularly in the area of electronics. According to author and ex-Avro employee E.K. Shaw, 650 major subcontractors were working on various aspects of the program. Their orders for work in 1959 would total some $25 million. To quote from an internal memo that was sent to remaining employees some 3 months after the cancellation, quote, "No effort has been made to date to settle termination contracts with any of the hundreds of companies involved. Many of them are owed from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars for investments already made in plant equipment and tooling and for complete parts and equipment already supplied, complete for the first 37 aircraft. Many of these firms are facing bankruptcy as a result. However, if these contract termination charges were to appear in the government's budget in the current year, it would become obvious at once to even the most thoughtless Canadian that we had not only lost a $300 million investment, but that it had also cost us as much to scrap it as it would have to complete it." Not only did the cancellation of the Arrow program have significant financial consequences for many companies, a Globe and Mail editorial in December 1958 observed the following, quote, "One of the virtues of the Arrow's development has been its contribution to Canada's industrial diversification. With the Arrow and CF-100 expenditures, we have bought new skills, new techniques, new industrial processes, and plants which otherwise would not exist, but which today range far beyond the needs of the Avro program in their service to Canada." With the demise of the Arrow, continued expansion into areas of advanced technology were lost. Many of the top employees left, not just the company, but Canada. Writing in Ideas in Exile, historian J.J. Brown observed the following, quote, "In economic terms alone, the decision to cancel the Avro programs was one that was to impair our standard of living for decades to come. This is not so much because of the money lost, but chiefly because the Avro design team that it had gathered with so much difficulty from all over the world was, in 1958, considered the best aircraft team in North America. These men's ideas stimulated a ferment in nearly every other Canadian industry. This would have resulted in a host of new products and techniques. But with the cancellation of the Arrow, the team dispersed almost immediately. Indeed, 25 top engineers ended up at NASA working on John Glenn's space capsule and later gaining major positions in the Gemini and Apollo space programs. Jim Floyd returned to Britain to work for the Advanced Project Group at Hawker Siddeley Aviation. There, that group carried out the early feasibility studies with British Aircraft Corporation, BAC, on what was being called the UK Supersonic Transport, or UKSST, before it was renamed the Concorde. Later, from 1965 to 1972, Floyd was a consultant with the British government on the operations and economics of the Concorde in an airline environment, including studies on the sonic boom. A few other employees ended up in various American and European firms, including McDonnell Douglas and Fokker International. But it was not like this for all. Frank Harvey came to Canada in 1956 after serving as an apprentice with de Havilland in England. He started with Avro in October of 1956 in the repair and overhaul department working on the CF-100. From there, he moved to work on the Arrow in the flight test department until the axe fell on Black Friday. After losing his job in this high-technology sector, he went to work in delivery for Simpsons, a department store in downtown Toronto. From there, he moved to Thistletown, Ontario, to work at his dad's service station. In 1963, he returned to Toronto and obtained employment at de Havilland Canada, which by now had acquired the Avro plant. Ian Mitchell joined Avro in 1957 after graduating as a mechanical engineer from McGill University in Montreal. He was also interested in aviation and in particular with the work at Avro, but he also applied to Spartan Air Services in Ottawa and Genair in St. Catharines. Avro offered him employment in the Arrow's ground support equipment design unit, and at a higher rate of pay than his other offers, so he moved to Toronto. The city had the added attraction of having an RCAF reserve unit 400 Squadron. He had been a member of the reserves in Montreal, and this was an opportunity to continue that involvement. Mitchell enjoyed his brief period at Avro and was devastated by the cancellation. He found himself not just unemployed, but rather disheartened with the state of aeronautical work in Canada. In his view, it was mostly tied to defense and therefore dependent on politics. As a young, single graduate, he knew he had options. He was also not so upset at being fired for any personal failing, because he had been fired in such excellent company, with some especially talented individuals. He did feel bad for many who had recently emigrated from other countries, most notably the United Kingdom. They had families, they had purchased homes, they had left careers back home, and after a short period in Canada, they were now unemployed. He considered his options, but took his time, noting that, for example, de Havilland, Canadair, and Trans-Canada Airlines were not hiring. Mitchell briefly considered moving to the United States, but he wanted to remain in Canada, so he ended up applying to a consulting firm in Montreal with which he was familiar. The latter provided the mechanical, electrical, and other systems designs for new buildings. He was placed in the Toronto office, where he remained with 400 Squadron. He later worked in the firm's Montreal and St. John's, Newfoundland offices. In 1962, he left the company to complete a 2-year degree in hospital administration at the University of Toronto. Eventually, he retired after serving in the Public Service of Ontario, far removed from anything aviation-related. Unfortunately, there are no statistics as to how many of the 25,000 released employees got back into the workforce, in what areas, how long it took, how many had to move elsewhere, whether the new jobs were still in the high technology sector, and what hardships were endured. Some critics of the Arrow have stated that there was in fact no brain drain, since in their view, the plane was mostly designed and built by teams from Britain, so it was not a Canadian aircraft at all. James Floyd, the chief design engineer on the Arrow, noted, however, that while some individuals did come from the United Kingdom, most were recruited from Canadian universities, like, for example, the brilliant Jim Chamberlain, chief aerodynamicist on the Arrow. Hailing from Kamloops, British Columbia, Jim was one of 25 who went on to prominent positions in the United States National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, after the cancellation. James Floyd himself, though from Great Britain, became a Canadian citizen, like many of the others who had immigrated to work on the program. It is clear, then, that the cancellation of the Arrow did result in a flight of technical talent. The anger caused by this brain drain and the frustration regarding the potential for loss of developing technological industries in Canada help explain why the Arrow's legacy has endured as a subject of passionate interest over the years. Further contributing to the interest in the Arrow is the manner in which the program was canceled. Many of the documents regarding the political and military discussions involved in the cancellation of the program were supposedly destroyed or remained classified, secret, and top secret. The company was told to immediately cease and desist all work, and most significantly, no seemingly good explanation was offered at the time for the cancellation and the ultimate physical destruction of all completed aircraft, engines, tooling, and technical information. As a result, rumors spread that the aircraft was somehow technically flawed, that the company had been taking advantage of the taxpayer, and that the program in general was too expensive. All of these contributed in their own way to keeping the passion, and therefore the memory of the Arrow and the people who built it, and flew it, alive. Say what you will about Avro Canada Limited itself, the fact remains that in an era in which high-profile military acquisitions have taken years just to get a contract in place, and many more before deliveries start, this company took the Arrow from a scratch design in 1953 to first flight in 1958, a mere 5 years. This also at a time when supersonic jet aircraft development was still in its early stages. 5 Arrows flew by the end of 1958 and early 1959, achieving some 95% of the flight envelope. On its third flight, the Arrow went supersonic at Mach 1.1 at 40,000 feet. On only its 7th flight, using Pratt & Whitney J75 engines, not the most powerful Iroquois engines specifically developed for it, it achieved Mach 1.52 at 50,000 feet, while still accelerating and climbing with excess thrust available. Arrows beginning with the 6th completed aircraft, Arrow 206, were designated the Mark II, as they would be fitted with the Iroquois. With the first 5 Mark I's flying, and the first Mark II, Arrow 206, being readied for taxi and subsequent flight trials, and with all the materials and tools in place for another 31 aircraft all ready for assembly, the axe came down. The Arrow program was terminated without prior notice on Black Friday, February 20th, 1959. Had the program been allowed to continue, deliveries would have started flowing well under the extended time frames of today. Not bad for a company that has been so maligned over the years. The company also designed and developed, again starting from zero, including the initiation of the company itself, a world-class civilian regional jet, the jetliner. Effectively on the drawing boards in 1946, designed for Trans-Canada Airlines, which later became Air Canada, the jetliner took to the air August 10, 1949, just 3 years after the start of development. The jetliner story has been covered in previous works, but it must be noted here that the jetliner was also a much maligned project. Although the plane is considered by some to have been a disastrous design, its design engineer, James C. Floyd, was awarded the prestigious Wright Brothers Medal, considered the Nobel Prize in aviation circles, by the Society of Automotive Engineers for excellence in design, the first non-American recipient. The jetliner was years ahead of any other intercity jet in the world. It flew almost flawlessly until it was ordered scrapped on December 10, 1956, some 7 years after that first flight and just before the Boeing 707 would take to the skies as the first commercial North American jet. Now, one point of clarification: the first commercial jet to take to the air anywhere was the British Comet, beating the jetliner by a few weeks. The difference, though, is that the Comet was designed for transoceanic travel, while the jetliner, like some of the Bombardier jets of today, was an intercity or regional jet. The Comet, unlike the jetliner, suffered significant problems over time. Indeed, it experienced several losses of aircraft, killing all passengers on board. This resulted in the grounding of the fleet until the cause could be determined. Simply put, the problem was eventually traced to stress fractures initiating from the square corners of the aircraft's windows and propagating through the rest of the aircraft. The jetliner, on the other hand, had been designed with circular windows precisely to avoid this type of issue. This and many other features of the jetliner were heralded in Aviation Week magazine, which was later renamed Aviation Week and Space Technology. Aviation Week hereafter. Some have tried finding fault with the design of the jetliner. For example, the plane had a straight wing configuration, not swept-back wings. Critics claimed that this resulted in poor aerodynamic efficiency. In fact, the jetliner wing configuration gave the aircraft added stability, enhancing the safety of the plane. Recall, it was 1949, and nothing like it had been seen before, with the exception of some military jets. So apprehension about the safety of commercial jets was extremely high, and Avro sought to allay those fears. With its straight wings, the jetliner was still far superior to any turboprop aircraft in terms of speed, interior noise, vibration, and overall passenger comfort. When, during a flight test, a problem did occur with the landing gear, the aircraft was made to do a gentle belly flop landing. There were no engine blades to break off when the plane landed, so there was nothing hitting the ground, spreading shrapnel across the airstrip. The plane simply slid to a stop with minimal damage, proving the jetliner was safer than turboprop aircraft. At one point, the jetliner was flown to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in the United States, where American test pilots were allowed to fly it as they would a military fighter. The results were so devastatingly good that in a secret letter from the Canadian Joint Staff in Washington, revealed for the first time in Requiem for a Giant, Avro Canada and the Avro Arrow, hereinafter referred to as Requiem, the following is stated, quote, "It is now confirmed that the USAF wished to purchase 12 jetliners." This, of course, belies the comments made over the years that the jetliner could not be sold to anyone. The USAF was prepared to use the jetliner as a high-speed bombing trainer and possibly as a tanker for refueling others. The existence of this letter came as a complete surprise to Jim Floyd when discussed with him before publication in Requiem in 2003. It had been sent to the Department of National Defense. There is no paper trail to show where it went from there, but Floyd was certain that it was not sent to the company. In 1952, it was decided the jetliner could be used as a test bed for the Hughes MG-2 fire control system that was to be fitted to the CF-100. The fire control system is what allows the aircraft to fire its weapons at a target. For this, the jetliner was flown to the Hughes Airfield in Culver City, California. There, it caught the attention of billionaire engineer Howard Hughes himself. He held on to it for 6 months, flying down Avro's engineers and test pilots to assist with his evaluation of the plane. His intention was to study the plane and then, if he deemed it suitable, purchase it in quantity for his airline company, Trans World Airlines, TWA. Hughes involved Convair, an American aircraft company, to develop a plan for production of the jetliner in the United States. In his book, The Avro Canada C-102 Jetliner, Jim Floyd notes that the Hughes report, produced in 1952, indicated that the first aircraft could be provided by 1954. When the plan was sent to officials in the U.S. government, though, they turned it down because Convair, they said, had to focus on its military commitments. This was much the same line C.D. Howe used to stop all work on the jetliner in Canada. Those who built the jetliner knew it was a great aircraft, as did all those who flew it and those whose job it was to scrutinize the design, like the Director of Engineering and Maintenance for TransCanada Airlines, Jas T. Bain. In a letter to the Vice President of Operations, Bain stated, quote, "It was interesting to see the evidence of interest shown by most of the major airlines on this continent. In particular, Eastern Airlines are serious enough in their discussion that the second prototype will be built with the double-slotted flap, which will meet Eastern's low landing speed requirement. A physical examination of the aircraft showed a quality of workmanship which I have never seen surpassed on a prototype aircraft, nor indeed by many production aircraft. Taken by and large, the jetliner surpasses the quality achieved by Canadair in production of the North Star." This letter was never made public until published in Requiem. With bona fide orders at hand, and even though Avro would have crushed its competition at the time, the jetliner project was canceled. The official government reason given for the termination was that Avro had to focus on developing and producing, again from scratch, a military fighter, the CF-100 Canuck. This fighter was to be made ready for the Korean War, and the jetliner, it was claimed, was taking time and resources away from that effort. The government official behind aircraft development at the time was C.D. Howe, the Minister of Munitions and Supply. Howe was an expat American engineer. In 1946, Howe had pushed for the development of the North Star, the aircraft mentioned in the memo quoted above. The North Star was a piston-engined aircraft developed by Canadair, a company owned by the Canadian government. C.D. Howe had made special arrangements with the Douglas Corporation in the United States to allow Canadair to build the fuselage of this aircraft since it was from the DC-4 design. He further managed to have British Merlin engines installed. The first North Star had been christened in 1946 by his wife. As reported in Requiem, TransCanada Airlines was prepared to purchase 10 North Stars, but was told by Howe to purchase 20. Howe further told the Department of National Defense that they would purchase 24. What they were to do with them, though, was not fully explained. Not long after production began in 1947, Howe authorized the sale of Canadair to the American Electric Boat Company, the forerunner to General Dynamics. This, he claimed, was to assist Canada in acquiring advanced American technology, a refrain that would be echoed years later in relation to the Arrow and the Bulmark missile. By the early 50s, the North Star would have been in direct competition with the jetliner, a competition the North Star would have lost, according to a government report prepared for Howe by the Department of Transport in June of 1950. This report, which looked at the cost-effectiveness of running the jetliner versus the North Star between Toronto, Montreal, and New York, showed the jetliner to be more than competitive. Also, since it would have cut the travel time of trips flown in propeller aircraft in half, the authors observed it would become extremely popular with the public. C.D. Howe's reaction to the report has not been recorded, but he did stop development of the jetliner, allegedly to allow for focused development of the CF-100, which, as noted, was supposedly needed to help fight the Korean War. Did Howe have a stake in Canadair, the American Electric Boat Company, or both? Might this have swayed him in his decision on the jet? There is no record, but it's an interesting topic for speculation. Was he not aware of the USAF decision to purchase the jetliner and of interest from Howard Hughes and others? He must have been, but it would appear that none of it mattered. Howe made the decision that Avro should discontinue production of the jetliner and focus on the CF-100, and that was that. However, there appears to have been no real requirement for the CF-100 to join the battle in Korea. F-86 Sabre aircraft were already in use there and would remain the key fighter in the war. In addition, Canadian pilots who served did so under the auspices of the U.S. military and again in Sabres. So the explanation given for canceling production of the jetliner in favor of the CF-100 in order to make the latter available in time for the Korean War is questionable. Whether the decision was valid at the time or whether there were ulterior motives is difficult to assess. Many records about this episode have disappeared, according to an archivist interviewed back in the early 90s. Officially, Avro was to focus on building the subsonic CF-100. This aircraft also went on the drawing boards in 1946 and first flew in 1950. Again, not bad by today's military acquisition standards. The design, though, was problematic because of structural issues, which delayed its development. One prototype crashed, killing the pilot, although subsequent investigation showed the